Howdy, welcome back to the channel. I'm Chris. I'm a veteran with a disability rating. I'm a former veteran service officer, and I'm a current VA claims trader. If you found this information helpful or you've had a question answered in the comments, please subscribe to the channel. That would help us a lot. Okay, thanks. I'm holding in my hand something that you can't see, but it's the toxic exposure risk activity job aid, the July 17th, 2024 version. That is the most recent update that we've had. So you're getting information here that if you don't currently work in the system, you might find it hard to get this information. If you have a condition which the VA has determined is the result of physical trauma to your joints or muscles, and if it's unclear that it's due to physical trauma, we will consider it physical trauma. That's just the rule. And so we're talking about sprains, tears, fractures, dislocations, arthritis, degenerative disc disease. We're talking about all kinds of different issues that relate to your foot, pes planus, turf fasciitis, a TBI, or any congenital development issues like lower extremity bone shortening, that kind of thing. If there's a joint condition and we would normally assume that's related to physical trauma, and we see that you have a toxic exposure conceded, we won't order an exam based on a TERA medical opinion for one of those conditions. Now, there are some exceptions. If you happen to present just the right amount of competent scientific medical evidence that shows that it may not be due to physical trauma, there's no clear etiology, there may be an exception, but for the most part, we're not going to order an exam for TERA for fractures and physical trauma joint issues. The only other exception to that is under MUCMEs, so Gulf War veterans that have the exposure for the Gulf War. There is a certain kind of like undiagnosed joint problem that you might have. If there's no etiology, if there's no known cause already understood, you might be able to file based on a MUCME. But in that case, if they make a diagnosis, it's probably going to rule you out as a MUCME because a lot of those kind of conditions are more like undiagnosed. When I first got my respiratory connected, it was under an undiagnosed. It was just basically dyspnea, which is like shortness of breath. And because I was in the Middle East and they couldn't tie it to anything else, they found that it related to a MUCME. So that's an exception, okay? So that's condition-based, that's physical trauma. How about mental disorders? So mental disorders, now, toxic exposures they found can result in neural behavioral decline, but decreased memory concentration. But in general, you'll almost never get a toxic medical opinion request from the VA for you for a mental disorder. So if you're trying to file for generalized anxiety or depression or PTSD, and you're trying to say it's associated with burn pits or particulate matter or Agent Orange, most of the time you'll never get an exam based on that TERA. You'll get likely an exam if you were in a combat theater based on fear of the enemy. If you have a combat award, you'll get one just based on that alone. You can, at least that'll get you an exam is what I'm saying, not necessarily your service connection. So physical traumas are exceptions to TERA. Mental disorders are exceptions to TERA with some, again, if you provide enough competent medical scientific evidence to say that a TERA medical opinion may be needed, there may be an exception, but for the most part, there won't be. Number three, for those of you that have the Agent Orange concession, those of you that served in Republic of Vietnam, Guam, Thailand, any of those other areas where we've conceded herbicide, there's been enough research through the National Academies of Science since 1993, according to this memo, that they don't believe these malignant or non-malignant conditions should have an exam for TERA. And most of those malignant conditions are all nasty cancers. Now, there are some that are presumptive, like obviously prostate cancer, but a lot of these cancers like basal cell, squamous cell, I see a lot of veterans filing for basal and squamous. Now, you might get that on a secondary type of medical opinion with enough evidence, but you're not going to get that based on herbicide. It's going to have to be some other TERA that you're trying to associate with those cancers to get it. Does that make sense? Okay. But also COPD, that's a big one. If you're filing for COPD and your only association is herbicide, you're not going to get an exam for that. You're not going to get a medical opinion. So what I'm saying for those of you with herbicide concession, if that's your only TERA and you've been denied on that TERA, there may be other TERAs that you could file for those same conditions. So you can't file for herbicide related to COPD. You won't typically get an exam for that. but you might be able to file for that based on asbestos and PFAS and other things like that. So, diseases of the eye would also be an exception for herbicide exposure, hearing loss, asthma, gastrointestinal, peripheral neuropathy. Usually that's related to diabetes. That's a secondary. It's very easy to get that connected if you have diabetes. So claims processors won't normally order an exam based on TERA if you have a herbicide and you have any of those conditions, and that's what the only TERA that you chose. So we talked about anyone of any era that files for physical trauma secondary to TERA. Normally, you won't get an exam for that. Mental disorders, herbicide with any of those limited conditions that the National Academy of Sciences said they've done enough research that there's not, in their opinion, an association. And then let's go on to this is one that a lot of you don't think about. If you have a certain condition and disability that manifested with a known etiology not associated with TERA, it's very hard to later try to associate a TERA. This is a great example. Hypothyroidism. If you had hypothyroidism only develop as a result of having your thyroid removed, you'd have to go after the thyroid condition, because hyperthyroidism, even though it's a presumption, if it had a known etiology and it was caused by something unrelated to TERA, generally you won't get that service connected. So you have to go after it. You have to go after the thyroid condition, because if you get the thyroid condition, you'll get all the downstream effects of that, such as hypothyroidism. Now, if you didn't have a thyroid operation, have your thyroid removed and develop hypothyroidism, you likely will get that service connected just based on your presumption of Agent Orange. So that's an example of that. And if I misspoken anyway on that, I'm moving a mile a minute. I apologize. So here's an example. You claim right knee strain, and it's a condition that we believe is due to physical trauma. It'd be an exception under our TERA exam requirements, and your claims processor would not order a TERA exam with a request for medical opinion for that. Now, there may be a direct that we'll order for that if we see the condition in service. So, for instance, if you had a knee sprain in service and you had a couple extra complaints about that in service, and then 30 years later you have knee strain, that would be a continuous thing that we could order an exam and we would ask for an opinion, like a direct medical opinion. Or if you had serious back lumbar condition, and over time that resulted in additional downstream issues with your joints, like your knees, and you're favoring one side over the other, you might get that on a secondary. Or so that's how that would work. But getting a TERA exam with medical opinion just based on, again, physical trauma, normally you wouldn't get that. And last but not least, when you have an actual ILER that says you performed an activity with the potential for exposure, if it just lists that you carried out the activity but doesn't list the exposure as they do, we would concede TERA, but you wouldn't get an exam for that. It's kind of a weird exception. And then the other one would be you had a post deployment. It wasn't in any of the presumptive locations. Let's say it was France or Spain or Germany, and you self-reported on the way out, hey, I got exposed to burn pits. Well, that's not going to generally be enough for us to order an exam, because there's not a presumption for burn pits based on that location. Or if you said this would be a little bit better example. You said I was in combat in the Middle East and they flew me over there for a day, and we've got no evidence of that. You wouldn't get a TERA exam until we could corroborate that. That's how that works. I hope that was somewhat helpful. And until next time, y'all take care.